days from the inauguration, the Capitol an armed camp, the country on edge.
There have been domestic terror threats against state capitals all over the United States.
We covered all this morning on This Week.
From ABC News, it's This Week. Here now, Chief Anchor George Stephenopoulos.
Good morning and welcome to This Week. Insurrection, impeachment, inauguration. 3 Wednesdays, 3 weeks unlike any others in American history. And in just 3 days, Joseph Robinette Biden will take the oath of office, addressing America in crisis. Plagued by a pandemic, economic hardship, deeply divided, reeling from the most dramatic act of domestic terrorism our country has ever seen. All inspired by the president leaving office. As we come on the air this morning, there are more U.S. troops protecting the Capitol than in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, and Somalia combined. The mall where almost 2 million people gathered for Barack Obama's inauguration will be empty when Joe Biden swears to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And not long after, all 100 senators will take an oath of their own, promising to do impartial justice in the second Trump impeachment trial. Head swirling.
That's the one that incites riots right there.
Living through a major moment in the life of our republic. And we're going to try to do it justice this morning, starting with our Chief White House correspondent, John Carl, our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. Pierre, let me begin.
All three bias for the Democrats.
Now, they even have a green zone. Now, that's a term we usually associate with Baghdad.
George, this truly now is Fortress Washington. The city is in near total lockdown. Look at these images of more National Guard arriving at Andrews Air Force Base yesterday, pushing the number of troops toward 25,000 that will be here on Inauguration Day. Just extraordinary. There are military vehicles and police cars on every corner. Streets are shut down. Fences with razor wire erected. The National Mall is essentially closed. As I drove in this morning, Constitution Avenue was blocked. No traffic allowed.
And where were they January the 6th when President Trump made his speech? Nowhere to be found because the mayor of Washington, D.C. refused to call him in.
Showing up in large numbers with guns. But this threat extends beyond Washington to all 50 states. The latest sign, the U.S. Postal Service is removing mailboxes and suspending mail collection across 17 states ahead of the inauguration. An obvious concern, the potential for bombs. Authorities are worried that states may not have enough resources, George, to protect government buildings.
And Pierre, every day that goes by, we're learning that siege of the Capitol is even more dangerous than we knew in real time.
George, we have some disturbing new evidence about Vice President Pence and Speaker Pelosi. Sources are pointing to a man in the case of Dominic Pezzola, who was accused of being the man in this video smashing a window to get into the Capitol. Criminal charges filed against Pezzola state that a witness has come forward claiming to have had a conversation with Pezzola and other members of the group that stormed the Capitol. The witness says they discussed how Pezzola and others allegedly went to the Capitol and would have killed Speaker Pelosi and Vice President Pence if they had been given a chance. There was also discussion of coming back to D.C. to kill everyone that they could get a hold of, George.
Boy, that is just chilling. You also have first-hand testimony from 2 of the police officers assaulted by the mob.
George, on a personal and professional note, I'm still reeling from a conversation I had with 2 officers who've been seen in those 2 infamous videos that have gone viral. One crushed in the door yelling for his life, the other who had been viciously beaten by an angry mob outside the Capitol. Their story raised the hair on the back of my neck. They talked of a medieval-scale fight, a Game of Thrones brawl, members of the mob frothing from the mouth with nothing but hate and anger in their eyes, and both men wondering if they were going to live to tell their stories, George.
Pierre Thomas, thanks very much. Let me bring in John Carl for more on the impeachment trial that is to come. We don't know much about when the Senate trial is going to start, what it's going to look like. What do we know about how President Trump is preparing?
George, the president's been talking to a lot of people about his upcoming trial, but his strategy is very much in the air. I had a lengthy conversation yesterday with Rudy Giuliani, who said that he is working on the president's defense, at least for now. But then a former Trump campaign spokesperson put out a statement claiming that the president hasn't made his mind up as to who will lead his defense. And George, I talked to Giuliani about his approach to the trial, what he would do. He said that he would encourage the president that he would bring up all of those discredited claims about voter fraud, claims that Giuliani himself has brought up in courtroom after courtroom around the country and have been discredited. He said that if he can prove that those claims are true or that the president had reason to believe they are true, then you can't accuse him of inciting the mob. I don't know how that legal strategy will fly, but Giuliani also said that he would not rule out the president himself testifying in his Senate trial.
Well, that would be something. Our new poll shows that 68% of the country opposes a self-pardon, but the president's still considering that?
I'm told he's very much still considering it. He's been advised by all of the lawyers who are still here working at the White House not to do it, that it probably wouldn't stand up to constitutional scrutiny, and it could complicate efforts after he leaves the White House, leaving the president vulnerable to civil lawsuits. But Giuliani, for his part, told me that he thinks the president would be fully justified in pardoning himself. And then he said about that concern about civil lawsuits, George, his legal life, the president's legal life, is going to be complicated no matter what. I'd much rather have my civil life complicated than my criminal life. That was what Rudy Giuliani said about a self-pardon.
Okay, you know, the Trump White House has never been a conventional White House. I take it right now it's more strange than ever?
George, it's bizarre. This place is basically empty. Most of the senior staff and almost all of the junior staff have already packed up their desks, packed up their offices, and are gone. It is a very empty place, and I'm told that the president is spending a considerable time planning his exit. He wants a big farewell with lots of military fanfare.
Still attacking him, aren't you?
Up to Air Force One, military bands, and he even is talking about a military flyover, fighter jets flying over.
I wouldn't believe 10% of what you guys have to say. You've been the ones attacking him for 5 years, including George Stephanopoulos and all of these guests.
Freshman Republican Peter Meyer, one of 10 Republicans who voted for impeachment. Congressman Castor, let me begin with you. I want to get to impeachment, but first, you just heard John Carl say the president is still considering a self-pardon. If that happens, should the Biden Justice Department investigate and bring a suit against President Trump?
Well, obviously that's going to be a decision that's going to be left up to the Department of Justice under President Biden. You know, I have said over the years that I think it's quite possible that there were crimes committed by President Trump, but I'm going to leave that to the Biden folks.
Let's talk about impeachment. I know it's a fluid situation right now.
He's
What do you know about
talk about his crimes, if there's any at all.
So the trial can start.
Biden goes in with crimes,
Well, all
and
of us
Hunter
on
Biden.
the impeachment manager team are ready to go when the trial does start.
And
We're
you
ready
all,
to lay out the
for
evidence that
your
the president
spying on the president
incited a
illegally
insurrection
in the beginning of his
resulting
term.
in the loss of lives of 5 Americans. And so there's, of course, conversations going on between Speaker Pelosi and the Senate, but we'll be ready to go when it starts.
And would you prefer it sooner rather than later?
You know, we're preparing as though we're going to go in the next hour. We've been working very hard. We've been gathering all the evidence. And so, of course, all of us are very anxious to get started.
How lengthy a trial should we expect? Would you expect to be calling witnesses in this trial?
This is inciting riots right here, with being on television like this with George Stephanopoulos on all these lies.
Talking about a rigged election, who after the election insisted to his
Shamefully.
supporters that he was cheated, that the election was a stolen
My
one.
advice to everybody is to sit tight
Support him very strongly.
and just remember when the next election comes on, vote Republican,
And so we're going to do whatever we need to
not
do
Democrat.
to lay out the evidence to show the American people, and most of all the senators who are voting on this, that Donald Trump, through his words and actions,
Vote for godly principles, and it certainly isn't in the Democratic leadership.
And when all of this was going on, when there was a riot in the U.S. Capitol, also didn't send relief to quell it.
One of the points that Republicans have made in opposing impeachment, those who did oppose it, they've raised a First Amendment argument, pointed out that in his rally speech, the president also at one point told the crowd to remain peaceful.
Yeah, I think this is quite separate from the First Amendment. This is a president who, knowing that he was in a very combustible, emotionally charged situation, continued to work up his supporters, not once or twice, but repeatedly over and over, telling a big lie about a stolen election, even though, as you know, George,
The election was stolen, buddy.
60-something times, and
Get
lost
serious.
about 61
You changed the rules at the last minute so people could mail in thousands and thousands of votes, unchecked votes, in several states.
Senate floor of the United States, and was slow to act after that to quell it.
You just heard John Call report that Rudy Giuliani is talking to the president perhaps about testifying in the impeachment trial. Is that something you would welcome?
Well, we're still discussing strategy, obviously, and how we're going to handle the witnesses and so forth. And so, certainly if the president if that's something that he wants to do, then he's probably going to be able to do that because he's part of the trial, because it involves him.
Senator Cotton has said he won't vote to convict because a Senate trial of a former president is unconstitutional in his view. He cited the writings of retired appeals court judge Michael Luddig, who wrote in the Washington Post, the very concept of constitutional impeachment presupposes the impeachment, conviction, and removal of a president who is, at the time of his impeachment, an incumbent in the office from which he is removed. Are you concerned that they may be able to find that this is not constitutional, this trial?
I don't believe so. In fact, one of the other purposes of impeachment in this case is to make sure that President Trump is not able to run for federal office again.
That's what it's all about. That's what you want. You don't want him to be able to run again. You want to try to damage him. That's the whole thing. 5 years of doing that. Shame on you. You're the ones that ought to be thrown out of office. You aren't Americans. You're communists.
But even after he's left office, it's also making sure that he can't run for president again.
Right.
You only get to that vote if you find 17 Republican senators who will convict. It doesn't appear you have those votes right now, although it's a very fluid situation. Are you worried that if the Senate fails to convict a second time, this will be some kind of vindication for President Trump?
For any president, when you're dealing with impeachment, there's a high bar. You need 67 votes. But our plan is to go after every single vote. We want to make sure that every senator is standing up for this country, that every senator is considering the evidence against President Trump and the fact that he incited a deadly insurrection.
What about the evidence against you all? Shame on you.
That we'll be able to convince folks that, in fact, President Trump is responsible for inciting this deadly insurrection and that the Senate should convict.
Finally, we've heard from several of your colleagues who believe that there's evidence that some members of Congress, congressional staff, Capitol Police might have been accomplices in some way with the rioters on January 6th. Do you have any evidence of that? And how do you expect to follow up? What should be the consequences if true?
Well, sure. Look, anybody who helped, who actively participated and helped the people who ended up rioting and taking over the Capitol in a mob should be held accountable. And right now, I'm focused, of course, as an impeachment manager on the Senate trial of President Trump, but there will be a separate process to deal with the folks who may have also participated and helped in that riot.
Including yourselves.
Thank you very much for your time this morning. Let's bring in Congressman Meyer right now. We said 10 House Republicans voted for impeachment, freshman Republican.
Oh, yeah, we got all one side here.
First of all, let me get to that last
Typical every Sunday. Pro-Democrats. Bias. Fake news.
Congressional staff may have been accomplices in some way.
Thank you, George. I have not seen any evidence of that so far. I think it's important that we don't jump to conclusions and we don't get ahead of the process. I know all too often we let feelings get ahead of the facts. If anyone was responsible or participated, they should be held to the fullest extent of the law, and we can talk about those remedial processes later. But at the moment, I think it's important we don't jump to conclusions.
In the wake of the Capitol siege, you called this the worst week of your life. You voted for impeachment. I read that you and some of your colleagues may also be buying body armor to protect yourself. What have these last few days been like?
Absolutely gut-wrenching. Impeaching a president, especially a president of my own party, was nothing that we ever hoped to do. Many of us deliberated deeply. This was not as easy as just saying what is in our political interest, but frankly, looking at the evidence, looking at the facts of the case, reading the article.
You didn't even wait for the facts to be determined, buddy.
Lived experience, and it was. I think this
Sheesh,
is a time
shameful.
for reflection, but it's also a time for accountability, and that's something that I am deeply committed to. I'm calling on my party to restore trust, to restore the trust of the voters.
You're the one that's taking away trust, buddy. Shameful on you.
January 6th and what happened on January 6th. We never allow that outburst of political violence to occur in our name again.
Well, then tell the mayor to call in the troops like she should have, to be protected. It would have prevented all this nonsense.
Joined those objections to the elections and propagated those false claims about voter fraud?
False claims, George. You don't know.
Everyone else's hearts. I know I've talked with many of my colleagues, asked them issues. Many of them arrived at their decisions, I think, in an honest and forthright way. Specifically when it came to, the objections to certifying the Electoral College, or, kind of more colloquially, an attempt to overturn the election. There were concerns there. And to me, the challenge is not what the individual concern of one individual was. What happens when all of those concerns become a collective, and the narrative becomes something that can be very powerful. That's what we saw with the Stop the Steal argument after November 3rd. It was individual concerns about electoral integrity building to something that ended up supporting the president's, false idea that he had won in a landslide. And that was what inspired his followers to come out on January 6th. That was the message that he was propagating. But we need to make sure that we move away from a politics of deception. We need to make sure that we have leaders who are telling folks who trust them what they need to hear.
You need to listen to God. And if you want to change parties, change parties. Be a Democrat.
To impeach because the president still has such a strong hold on the Republican Party. So many in the Republican Party believe what he said about the election. You said your vote may have been political suicide. That caught the attention of one of the president's advisors, Jason Miller, who retweeted it as well. Are you concerned you ended your career with that vote?
No, because you'll just become a Democrat.
May very well have. But I think it's also important that we have elected leaders who are not thinking solely about what's in their individual self-interest, not what is going to be politically expedient, but what we actually need for the country. It's not lost on me that I hold the seat that Gerald Ford held from 1948 to 1973. He committed a courageous act when he pardoned Richard Nixon, but it ended his political career going forward. I think I obviously don't want to follow in the footsteps in terms of the next election, but want to make sure that we have.
You should have been thrown out of office because you didn't wait for the facts to be determined.
Putting the interests of the country first rather than their own political careers.
And you put yourself first.
Like you voted for the impeachment, called it the greatest betrayal of the Constitution by a president in American history. But she's facing a lot of blowback from your colleagues, your Republican colleagues in the House. They want to remove her from leadership. Will that happen?
And she should be removed.
We're going to do everything we can to make sure that those who stood by their principles, like Liz Cheney, that is not
Stood by her principles. That she wanted to take over the Republican Party is what she wanted to do. Just like her father and like the Bushes out there. They've been upset ever since Donald Trump beat them in the primary.
By the leadership that Liz Cheney has shown. We differ on many issues, but in terms of somebody who is putting the best interests of the country forward, she has demonstrated that.
Nonsense.
The past 2 weeks.
Baby killers.
Is it time for the Republican Party to move on from President Trump?
I think it's time that we acknowledge that what happened on January 6th was a betrayal of what had been accomplished over the past 4 years. That it was a culmination of a politics that had all too often, fanned flames rather than focusing on building and governing.
And what are you doing?
The president brought some necessary energy,
Fanning flames.
necessary ideas.
If you'd waited for the facts, you'd have different facts to make a decision on.
He didn't know when to stop, and he didn't draw a line. And to me, political violence is the line that we must draw. We've seen that outgrowth on my side of the aisle, but that's something that has become all too common. The threats, intimidation, violence more broadly. This all goes back to the fact that too many Americans don't trust institutions, don't trust the process.
Well, I certainly don't trust you, buddy.
To resolve their disputes. So while I think we need to move past, those events, and we need to have accountability first and foremost, we also need to commit to resolve, our differences through legal processes. We need to build that confidence in the public.
Then why did you vote for impeachment of our president, shamefully, with no facts?
Make sure we get back to focusing on what matters.
What's the most important thing President Biden can do to heal that divide?
I think you can have an open and honest and transparent discussion. I think it's incumbent on both parties to ensure that they are not promoting folks within their ranks who are engaged in a politics of deception, but rather.
What about Hunter Biden
Honest,
and his family corruption of Joe Biden and his brother?
Will do the same, that he will not give in to some of the more, some of the lower impulses that folks in the progressive wing may try to bring out. but rather say that this is a time for the country to focus on rebuilding. This is a time for the country to focus on rebuilding trust, rebuilding our institutions, rebuilding governance. We need to get through the pandemic. We need to deal with the economic consequences and the fallout. But we also need to heal all of the divides that have been exposed over the past several years.
Congressman Meyer, thanks for your time this morning.
Congressman Meyer, I hope your citizens in your state throw you out on your ear.
Stay with us.
In the midst of a dark winter of this pandemic, as cases, hospitalizations, and deaths spike at record levels, there is real pain, overwhelming.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Economy.
I've got the COVID-19 myself, and so does my wife.
Don't get out of it overnight. And we can't do it as a separated and divided nation. The only way we can do it is to come together.
Come together? You've been attacking President Trump since the day you got the nomination.
The Washington Post shows that more than 2/3 of Americans approve of how Biden has handled the presidential transition.
And fake polls.
Administration from the White House, and Rachel, we can expect a blizzard of action for President Biden right after he takes the oath on Wednesday.
And Georgia will be the first action that Joe Biden takes as president of the United States. Much of this is going to be focused on undoing what President Trump did during his administration. Biden does plan on rejoining the Paris Climate Accord. He plans on reversing that travel ban for predominantly Muslim countries and making it mandatory to wear a face mask on federal property. He can't do that on his own, but much of his agenda is going to require Congress. And that Senate impeachment trial for President Trump could start as soon as next week. If it does happen during his first 100 days in office, there is no doubting this will pose a significant challenge for the president-elect. He's already unveiled a massive COVID relief package that he wants Congress to get through. He has a long list of cabinet secretaries that will need to be confirmed by the Senate. He is expecting Congress to multitask, even suggesting that they can split the day. But George, this is just going to be an inauguration that we have never seen before. Just take a look at the security perimeter behind you, George.
Yeah, and where was the security January the 6th when the president was there with a huge crowd? And the mayor of Washington, D.C. refused to call the National Guard in, even though they were ready and waiting.
Yes, so President-elect Biden, then President Biden, is going to come into office and take decisive steps to roll back some of the most egregious moves of the Trump administration. And he's going to take steps to move us forward. Across the course of the first week and a half in office, you're going to see him move on promises that he made on the campaign trail to ensure that we are focused on workers. You'll see him make good on his Buy American promise. You're going to see him make good on promises to move us toward a more just and racially equitable society. You're going to see him make movement on racial equity. And you're going to see him make movement on climate, on jobs.
Yeah, more rights for Black Lives Matters, Antifa. Where was he, and where were you, and where was George, and where was Chuck, baby, and all the other Democrats when the cities were being raided all across the country, and killing people, and looting, and riots, and arsonists, and racists? Where were they? Where were they?
People who've been hardest hit by this crisis all over the country, and it's an effort to fund a coordinated federal vaccine effort. It's an effort to get shots into American arms to ensure that we can once and for all finally get this virus under control and get our economy back on track.
You're already hearing some Democrats and many Republicans saying it's just too expensive.
There's been bipartisan support for all of these pieces. I would really point that out. I mean, if you look at the big core planks of this plan, for example, Senator Rubio supports direct relief checks. Senator Romney supports expanding the child tax credit. I mean, there is bipartisan support for the big planks of this plan. And I would also note that the plan came about as a result of consultation with bipartisan governors and mayors from all across the country. The president-elect spoke with Republican governors, with Republican mayors to hear what they need, what's going on with their constituents, what the most dire and important needs are for their constituents. And so this plan reflects the urgent needs, the things that people need right now. I mean, we've got millions of Americans unemployed. We've got thousands of Americans dying from the virus every day. There's no question we are in a state of emergency here. And this plan is designed to get the relief that people need to them right away. And President-elect Biden looks forward to working with Congress to get bipartisan support for this bill and get it done as quickly as possible.
First things first, the inaugural address that comes on Wednesday. You just heard Congressman Meyer say it's time for an open, honest, and transparent discussion from President Biden. He says rejecting the politics of deception. What can Americans expect to hear on Wednesday? What is the major goal of this address?
So I think what you'll hear from President-elect Biden on Wednesday will be a reflection of a lot of what you heard from him on the campaign trail, which is that he believes we can bring this country together. He believes that we have to bring this country together, that a unified America is the only way that we're going to be able to tackle the massive crises that we're grappling with.
Yeah, he threatened to take the president behind the barn and beat him up.
Because I'll let the president-elect
You Democrats are hypocrites.
But I think you can expect that this will be a moment where President-elect Biden will really work to try to turn the page on the divisiveness and the hatred of the last 4 years.
Well, then tell him to stop the impeachment immediately and apologize to the American people.
Really calls on all of us to work together. I think that's what Americans all across the country want. They want a government that once again is focused on doing the right thing by them.
Yeah, for 5 years you've been focused on how to destroy Donald Trump and Mike Pence's presidency illegally.
Because that's what Americans want. That's what they voted for in this election. 81 million Americans voted for President-elect Biden, in part because he was laying out a vision for this country that gets us to a place where we can work together. So you'll hear a lot of that from him on the 20th.
He'll be delivering that message across an empty mall there, the Capitol Mall. The entire U.S. Capitol has become an armed camp right now. You've had to cancel certain parts of the inauguration, including the train ride into Washington, D.C., including some rehearsals. Are you certain that the ceremony is going to take place on the west front of the Capitol as planned?
Well, that is certainly our plan. I think that will send an incredibly important visual image to the world about the resilience of American democracy. And so our plan and our expectation is that President-elect Biden will put his hand on the Bible with his family outside on the west side of the Capitol on the 20th. Look, there is no question, though, of course, we are in a volatile time. I think, unfortunately, you only have to look at the chatter on social media to see that we are in a volatile time. And so we are making preparations. We'll begin meeting tomorrow, daily meetings with the outgoing leadership in national security and law enforcement to ensure that we're preparing for any scenario that should arise.
And where were you January the 6th with security?
But we have full faith in the United States Secret Service and their partners who've been working for over a year on the planning to ensure that this event is safe. So we're very much looking forward to President-elect Biden putting his hand on the Bible at noon on the 20th.
Has the president-elect waiting with Speaker Pelosi and Leader Schumer on when the Senate trial of President Trump should start and how long it should go?
Well, obviously, ultimately, the mechanics and the logistics of the pace of the trial and how it should play out is up to congressional leadership. I think the president-elect has spoken publicly about his view here, which is that he hopes that the Congress will be able to do its constitutional duty, to discharge its constitutional duty, while simultaneously being able to focus on the business of the American people. He hopes that they're going to be able to immediately take up this package, the American Rescue Package that he laid out at the end of last week, and start to move forward on getting that money that we need out the door in order to get
and you think that's not inciting riots?
So his great hope is that they're going to be able to do that, and I think
you're hoping for riots. It's apparent.
The previous impeachment trial, the Senate was able to move forward on floor business while also conducting.
This is all just a method of conspiracy of you all trying to stop him and the Republicans from coming back in 2 years and taking back the House and then taking the presidency back in 2024. Politics as usual, dirty politics, and not anything like constitutional.
We'll be right back.
The orderly transfer of authority as called for in the Constitution routinely takes place, as it has for almost 2 centuries, in the eyes of many in the world. This every 4-year ceremony we accept as normal is nothing less than a miracle.
Roundtable's ready to go. We'll be right back.
Do you solemnly swear that you will support and defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic, so help you God?
I do.
Congratulations, Senator.
I, Joseph Robinette Biden Jr., do solemnly swear
That I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
that I will support and defend the Constitution of the United States
against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
So help me God.
So help me God.
And now Joe Biden, who is the youngest senator to take the oath, will become the oldest president to take the oath. Let's talk about all the challenges ahead on our roundtable with Chris Christie, Rahm Emanuel, Democratic strategist Karen Finney, also CNN political commentator, and Republican strategist Sarah Fagan. And Rahm, let me begin with you. This
All four negative to Trump.
Facing these multiple crises across the country could not be higher.
No, it could not. I mean, if you look at it, Abraham Lincoln had the Civil War. Wilson had obviously the pandemic. Roosevelt had the Depression. And obviously, Lyndon Johnson had the civil unrest in the United States. Joe Biden gets all of it. You haven't seen something like this obviously in any point in history. Every president's had, some presidents have had one of these, not all four. But he also then therefore has an opportunity. These crises offer a huge opportunity. And I do think if you look at your poll and you look at his presidency, his person is where he gets support. People reflect and love his decency, are drawn to it.
Oh my goodness gracious sakes alive. You've been promoting these guys so long, you're believing your own lies.
Remember, the American people want to turn from this type of Donald Trump politics of hunger game into normalizing.
5 years of Donald Trump is the best 5 years of my life in national government, and I'm 77 years old. He returned some godly principles which you have no understanding of. Millions of babies have been slaughtered thanks to you Democrats, including Joe Biden. Millions.
And reducing that, I'm sorry, George, the COVID reducing that impact on society is going to open up so many more of the doors, like on the economy for him.
And Chris Christie, how does he speak to Republicans, so many who still believe the election was stolen, who are still followers of President Trump?
Well, he's got to do his job, George. In the end, I think what the American people have learned over especially the last year or so is that, you know, competence really matters in the Oval Office in terms of managing things, and he's going to have to deal now with the challenge of COVID. I hear all the other things that Ron mentioned, and I don't disagree necessarily, but the number one issue is COVID. Until the COVID vaccine gets broadly distributed, until life gets back to some measure of normalcy, it will be what dominates Joe Biden's job. Because until that happens, you can't really bring back the economy to where it needs to be. You can't really deal with a lot of those underlying issues effectively until you get people feeling it once again as if they're safe. And this pandemic, with over 300,000 Americans dying, they don't feel safe. And so we need to get back to that. I think that's going to be his first task. If he does that, he has a chance to achieve a lot of other things that he might want to do in a very closely divided country. As long as he keeps his eye on getting COVID under control, the rest of it, I think, will come to him over the course of his first year.
Shame on you, Chris Christie. Turncoat for yourself. Just another jealous Republican who wanted to be president.
Well, look, I think the most important thing is that Joe Biden stays focused on the agenda that he was elected overwhelmingly by an overwhelming majority of the American people to implement. And I think we're already seeing both in the measures and the things that Biden has talked about since becoming elected that a majority of Americans agree with and appreciate the way he has conducted himself. And in addition to that, I think we will see this president, as the memo that Ron Klain laid out, put forward yesterday, some very quick, not surprisingly, I slightly disagree with Chris Christie, an agenda that will not only deal with the COVID crisis, but start to deal with the economy. People have not just fallen off the cliff, they are down into the ravine. And so, the incoming president has taken these issues on, as well as our environmental crises and the racial justice crisis. But I think the last thing I'll say, George, is the most important thing, and I think all Democrats and many Republicans of good faith agree, is accountability. We cannot move forward in unity from this moment.
Well, when's he going to have his confession ceremony for Hunter Biden, his son, and is taking funds from China and from Russia? When's he going to release the the laptop for all America to see.
Polarization as policy for too long has dominated, and so there's got to be accountability for what we saw at the Capitol if we are to move.
What you saw at the Capitol, where were the troops then when your mayor didn't call them in from Washington, D.C.?
Sarah Fagan, that's going to be a big question for the Senate, though. Can they handle the president-elect's agenda, deal with the president-elect's agenda as they're conducting the Senate impeachment trial?
I think that is the real challenge for Schumer, having to try to manage really this COVID package, which is likely going to have to get done. If he wants it as robust as the president-elect wants it, which includes the minimum wage and so many other policy priorities that are really
another $2 trillion.
COVID priorities, he's likely going to have to do it through the reconciliation process, and that becomes incredibly complex. Of course, he's got to confirm Janet Yellen and many other cabinet secretaries
Taken from the
and he's got to manage
taxpayers.
And it's a no-win situation for both parties. Getting rid of Donald Trump, I think, is a win situation for the country as a whole, but the Democrats are going to have to choose between a robust policy agenda.
See, all four of them so far totally against President Trump.
The president. We look complicit in the
even though 75 million Americans voted for him legally.
Loss of a big portion of our base. It is a very complex political dynamic, and I think, while I agree with Karen in the fact that Donald Trump should be held to account for the riot at the Capitol, I don't know that that is in Joe Biden's best interest.
How do Democrats deal with that dilemma, Ron?
Well, I think that, this is going to take a deft hand. Right now, you can say in the transition, the Biden people have done pretty good.
Oh, that's right, Rom. You're the one that created the saying, never let a crisis go to waste. That's all you're interested in. You people aren't interested in America. You're shameful. Shameful. No mention of godly principles whatsoever. Neither by George Stephenson. We hear he's going to put his hand on the Bible. Putting your hand on the Bible doesn't mean you're going to act like a Christian. Doesn't mean you're going to be a Christian. A lot of demons have put their hands on the Bible.
I mean, this is very, very important. There's not a single lawyer, except for one that's about to be disbarred by the New York bar, Rudy Giuliani, who wants to defend President Trump. That tells you something. And I think you can have the impeachment and deal with both confirmations and getting the country moving. And if anybody tries to use impeachment not to deal with COVID, they have a political problem. If the impeachment becomes a weight stopping you from dealing with COVID, that also becomes a problem. So both parties have a challenge, not just Chuck Schumer. And everybody's going to be looking in this intense...
Oh, shame on you. I wouldn't believe a thing you had to say. Period. Rahm Emanuel. Shameful.
Go ahead, Sarah.
Look, we're calling this a COVID package, and there are elements in this package that are very important for COVID relief. Vaccine distribution, of course, and money for getting schools back on track. But there's a lot more in here that Republican senators are not going to go along with.
Right.
Minimum wage may make sense in Boston. A $15 minimum wage may make sense in Boston and Los Angeles. Doesn't make sense in Oskaloosa, Iowa. And other things for the Democratic constituencies, particularly the state and local governments. Republicans aren't going to support that. So if the president-elect wants to get that accomplished, he will have to do it through reconciliation, and that is a much more complex process that the impeachment will detract from.
But Chris, I want to bring to you this dilemma for the Republican Party as well. Dan Balz had a smart column in the Washington Post today where he says that President Trump is leaving behind a Republican Party that is broken but still in his grip.